The morning that changed everything, the golden rays of dawn painted the glass towers of downtown Seattle in brilliant amber hues. Jonathan Clarke adjusted his platinum cufflinks as he stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city wake up 30 floors below. At 38, he had built Clarke Technologies from a small startup into a billion-dollar empire that dominated the artificial intelligence industry. His morning routine was as precise as the algorithms his company created. 6:15 sharp, black coffee, no sugar, financial reports from 3 continents. By 7 he would review the quarterly projections. 7:30 meant his first video conference with the Tokyo branch. Every minute calculated, every decision measured in profit margins and market share. His personal assistant knocked twice before entering. "Mr. Clarke, your car is ready downstairs. The board meeting starts at 9, and traffic on 5th Avenue looks heavy this morning." Jonathan nodded without turning from the window. Below, he could see people hurrying along the sidewalks like tiny ants, each carrying their own burdens, their own dreams. He had forgotten what it felt like to walk among them. Success had built invisible walls around his life, walls made of schedules and security protocols. 20 minutes later, Jonathan emerged from the lobby of Clarke Tower. His bodyguard, a former military man named Russell, walked 3 steps ahead, scanning the street with practiced eyes. The black Tesla waited at the curb, its door already open. "Good morning, Mr. Clarke." His driver greeted him with the same respectful tone he had used for the past 5 years. Jonathan slid into the leather seat, already pulling out his tablet to review the morning's agenda. The board would discuss the new project proposal, a revolutionary AI system designed to help hospitals manage patient care more efficiently. It was his pet project, something that went beyond profit margins and touched on actual human welfare. His late mother had spent her final months in a hospital where overworked staff struggled to provide adequate attention to every patient. That as the car pulled into traffic, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a message from his younger sister Rachel, the only family he had left. She was a teacher in Portland, living a simple life that he sometimes envied. Her text showed a photo of her kindergarten class holding up drawings they had made. "Thought you might need a smile today, big brother. Remember when we used to draw pictures together?" A faint smile crossed his lips as he remembered those afternoons in their small childhood home, before the money, before the empire, when happiness came from colored pencils and construction paper. He was about to reply when the car stopped at a red light near Pioneer Square. That was when he heard it. "Help! Someone please help me." The voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Jonathan looked up from his phone, his businessman instincts telling him to ignore it, to let his driver continue when the light changed. Street situations were not his problem. He had meetings, responsibilities, shareholders depending on his decisions. But something in that voice, raw desperation mixed with fierce determination, made him look toward the source. On the sidewalk, a young woman in blue scrubs was kneeling beside an elderly man who had collapsed near a bus stop. She was performing chest compressions, her dark hair falling across her face as she worked. Around her, morning commuters walked past, some glancing but none stopping to help. "Call 911, she shouted again, but people just quickened their pace, lost in their own worlds of deadlines and obligations. Jonathan watched her for a moment, noting the practiced way she positioned her hands, the steady rhythm of her compressions. She was clearly a medical professional, but she was alone, and the man on the ground was not responding. "Sir, the light is green," his driver said quietly. Jonathan hesitated. The rational part of his mind calculated the cost of delay. The board, meeting the contracts, waiting for signatures, the stock price that fluctuated based on his every public appearance. But as he watched the woman continue her desperate efforts to save a stranger's life, something shifted inside him. "Pull over," he said suddenly. "Sir, pull over now." Russell turned in his seat, eyebrows raised. "Mr. Clarke, we need to maintain your schedule. The board meeting. The meeting can wait." The car pulled to the curb, and Jonathan stepped out before anyone could protest further. He approached the scene, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete. The woman looked up as his shadow fell across her, her face streaked with sweat and tears of frustration. "Do you have a phone?" she asked breathlessly, never stopping her compressions. "I called 911, but they said the ambulance is stuck in traffic. He needs help now." Up close, Jonathan could see she was younger than he had first thought, maybe late 20s, with intelligent brown eyes that held both exhaustion and unwavering determination. Her hospital ID badge read Emma Rodriguez, RN, and was clipped to scrubs that had seen many long shifts. "What can I do?" The words came out before he could think about them. Take over compressions. I need to check his pulse again and clear his airway. Without hesitation, Jonathan dropped to his knees beside her, his $1,000 suit forgotten as it touched the dirty sidewalk. Emma quickly positioned his hands over the man's chest and showed him the rhythm. Her hands were warm and steady over his as she guided him through the first few compressions. Just like that, don't stop, no matter what. As Jonathan took over, Emma checked the man's airway and pulse. He's responding a little. Keep going. For the next several minutes, Jonathan found himself in a world completely different from boardrooms and profit charts. There was only the rhythm of compressions, the sound of Emma's calm voice guiding him, and the desperate hope that they could keep this stranger alive until help arrived. Around them, a small crowd had finally gathered. Someone offered a jacket to put under the man's head. Another person directed traffic around them. The walls that usually separated people in the city seemed to dissolve in the face of shared humanity. You're doing great, Emma said softly, checking the man's pulse again. I can feel it getting stronger. Jonathan looked at her as he continued the compressions. There was something about her presence that steadied him, a kind of quiet strength he had rarely encountered in his business world. She worked without fanfare or recognition, focused entirely on saving a life. The sound of sirens finally grew closer, and within minutes, paramedics arrived to take over. As they loaded the man onto a stretcher, one of them turned to Emma. Nice work, nurse. You probably saved his life. Emma stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her scrubs. We both did, she said, glancing at Jonathan with a grateful smile. As the ambulance pulled away, the crowd dispersed, and the morning routine resumed around them. But Jonathan remained on his knees for a moment longer, looking at his hands. They were dirty now, marked by the sidewalk and the life they had helped preserve. Emma extended her hand to help him up. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stopped. Jonathan accepted her help and stood, suddenly aware of how different he must look from the perfectly groomed CEO who had left his office that morning. I should be thanking you. You knew what to do. I just followed your lead. Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone willing to follow when it matters. They stood facing each other for a moment. Two people from completely different worlds who had just shared something profound. Jonathan realized he didn't want this moment to end, didn't want to return to his car and his meetings and his carefully controlled life. I'm Jonathan, he said simply. Emma. She glanced at her watch and her expression changed. Oh no, I'm supposed to be at work in 15 minutes. I'm already covering an extra shift because we're short-staffed. Before he could think about it, Jonathan found himself saying, let me give you a ride. Emma looked at his expensive car and his torn suit and shook her head. You've done enough. Besides, I'm sure you have important places to be. Nothing more important than this, he said, and realized he meant it completely. The words seemed to surprise them both. Emma studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but just to the hospital. And thank you, Jonathan, for stopping. For caring about someone you didn't even know. As they walked toward his car, Jonathan felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The morning sun seemed brighter, the air clearer, and the city around him felt alive with possibilities he had forgotten existed. He didn't know it yet, but Emma Rodriguez had just changed the entire course of his carefully planned life with a single shout for help. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Clarke was exactly where he needed to be. When worlds collide, the ride to Seattle General Hospital took 12 minutes. But for Jonathan, it felt like stepping into an entirely different universe. Emma sat in the passenger seat, still wearing her slightly rumpled scrubs, telling him about her work in the cardiac unit while his driver navigated through the morning traffic. We see about 40 patients a day, she explained, unconsciously massaging her hands after the chest compressions. Most of them are elderly, many don't have family nearby. Sometimes I'm the only person they talk to all day. Jonathan found himself fascinated by the way she spoke about her patients, not as cases or numbers, but as people with stories. It was so different from his world of quarterly reports and market analyzers. When they arrived at the hospital, he watched her gather her small purse and prepare to leave. Emma, he said as she reached for the door handle, would you let me buy you dinner sometime? To properly thank you for what you did today. She paused, her hand still on the door. You don't need to thank me, Jonathan. Helping people is just what you do when someone needs it. Maybe that's exactly why I'd like to see you again. Emma turned to face him fully, studying his expression with those intelligent brown eyes. After a moment, she smiled. Okay, but somewhere simple. I'm not really a fancy restaurant kind of person. They exchanged phone numbers, and as Emma walked toward the hospital entrance, Jonathan realized he was still sitting in his car, watching her go. She moved with purpose and confidence, stopping to hold the door for an elderly man with a walker, then disappearing into the building where she would spend the next 12 hours caring for people who needed her. Sir Russell's voice brought him back to reality. The board meeting. Jonathan checked his watch. He was already 45 minutes late. Yes, let's go. But as his car pulled away from the hospital, Jonathan's mind remained focused on Emma Rodriguez and the way she had made him feel useful in a way that had nothing to do with profit margins or stock prices. For the first time in years, he had helped someone without expecting anything in return, and the feeling was intoxicating. The board meeting was a disaster. Jonathan's mind kept wandering, and when questioned about the delay, he found himself struggling to provide a satisfactory explanation. The board members, all men in expensive suits who looked remarkably similar to his former self, exchanged glances of concern about their CEO's unusual behavior. Perhaps we should postpone the final decision until next week, suggested board member Harrison Webb, a man whose primary concern was maintaining their stock price above all else. You seem distracted today, Jonathan. Normally, such a comment would have infuriated him. Today, he simply nodded. That sounds reasonable. After the meeting, Jonathan returned to his office and found himself unable to concentrate on anything. Instead, he stood by his window again, looking down at the street, where people walked with their own purposes and problems. For the first time, he wondered about their stories instead of seeing them as obstacles to his morning commute. His assistant brought him lunch, but it sat untouched on his desk as he researched Seattle General Hospital online. He learned that it was understaffed and underfunded, struggling to serve a growing population of patients who couldn't afford private healthcare. He read about nurse shortages and long shifts, about medical professionals like Emma who chose to work in public hospitals, despite lower pay and difficult conditions. When his phone rang at 3 o'clock, Emma's name on the caller ID made his heart skip in a way that surprised him. Jonathan, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Nothing that matters, he said, and meant it. How was your shift? Long but good. I wanted to let you know that the man from this morning, his name is Henry Chen. The paramedic said he's stable now. He asked me to thank the businessman who helped save his life. Jonathan felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with business success. How did you find out his name? I stopped by the ER before my shift started. I always try to follow up when I can. It helps to know the outcome, you know. This simple act of caring struck Jonathan as extraordinary in his world. Once a deal was closed or a meeting ended, people moved on to the next opportunity. The idea of following up on a human connection, just to know that someone was okay, was completely foreign to his experience. Emma, about that dinner, are you free tonight? There was a pause. I don't get off until 11, and I'm exhausted. But there's a small diner near the hospital that stays open late. Nothing fancy, but they make great coffee and pie. That sounds perfect. At 10:30 that night, Jonathan Clarke walked into Rosie's diner wearing jeans and a sweater, the most casual clothes he had worn in public for years. The place was nearly empty except for a few hospital staff grabbing late meals between shifts. Emma was sitting in a corner booth, her hair down now and wearing a simple green dress that made her eyes look even more beautiful than he remembered. Look different, she said, as he slid into the seat across from her. Better or worse, more real. They talked for 2 hours over coffee and apple pie. Emma told him about growing up in a small town in eastern Washington, about choosing nursing, because she wanted to make a difference in people's lives. She spoke about her elderly patients with such affection that Jonathan found himself wondering what it would be like to be cared for by someone who saw him as more than just a business asset. What about you? Emma asked. What made you want to build a technology empire? Jonathan paused, realizing that no one had asked him that question in years. Business reporters wanted to know about his strategies and projections, but no one had ever asked about his motivations. I wanted to prove I could succeed, he said finally. My father left when I was 12. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep our family together. I promised myself I'd never be powerless again. And do you feel powerful now? The question caught him off guard. He thought about his morning routine, his scheduled life, the way everyone around him agreed with everything. He said because of his wealth and position, I thought I did. But this morning, when I was helping Henry, that felt different, like I was actually useful instead of just important. Emma reached across the table and touched his hand gently. There's a difference between having power over people and having the power to help them. When the diner finally closed at 1 in the morning, Jonathan walked Emma to her car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that she had clearly maintained with care despite its age. As she unlocked the door, she turned to face him. "Thank you for tonight, and for this morning. You could have just driven past, so could you? You could have walked past Henry." "No," she said simply. "I really couldn't have." Standing there under the streetlight in the empty parking lot, Jonathan realized that Emma Rodriguez operated from a completely different value system than anyone in his business world. She didn't help people because it would benefit her somehow. She helped because helping was simply who she was. "Emma, can I see you again?" She smiled. "I work Tuesday through Saturday this week, but Sunday I'm volunteering at the free clinic downtown. You could come with me if you want to see what real help looks like." The invitation was casual, but Jonathan sensed it was also a test. She was offering to show him a part of her world, to see if his interest in helping people extended beyond a single moment of crisis. "What time should I pick you up?" 8 in the morning, and Jonathan, "For something you don't mind getting dirty." As he drove home that night, Jonathan realized that everything in his carefully constructed life suddenly felt different. His penthouse apartment, with its expensive furniture and perfect city views, felt empty in a way he had never noticed before. The silence that had once seemed peaceful now felt isolating. He stood by his bedroom window, looking out at the city lights, and thought about Emma working her 12-hour shift, caring for people who needed her. For the first time in years, he went to sleep thinking about someone other than himself, and wondering what tomorrow would bring. In her small apartment across town, Emma Rodriguez was having similar thoughts about the billionaire, who had knelt on a dirty sidewalk to help save a stranger's life. She had met plenty of wealthy people at the hospital, family members who viewed medical staff as servants and expected special treatment because of their donations or insurance coverage. Jonathan was different. When he had helped with Henry's rescue, he had followed her lead without question, trusting her expertise even though she was just a nurse and he was used to being in charge of everything. There had been no ego in his actions, no sense that he was doing her a favor. He had simply seen someone who needed help and acted. As she drifted off to sleep, Emma wondered if she had been too quick to judge him based on his expensive clothes and car. Maybe underneath all that success was someone who had just forgotten how to connect with people. Someone who needed reminding that wealth meant nothing without compassion. She had no idea that across the city, Jonathan Clarke was lying awake asking himself the same question she was falling asleep wondering about. What would happen when two people from completely different worlds tried to build something together? The answer would come sooner than either of them expected. The ripple effect Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Seattle weather that most residents had learned to ignore. Jonathan stood in front of his walk-in closet, staring at clothes he hadn't worn in years. Emma had said to wear something. He didn't mind getting dirty, which eliminated most of his wardrobe. Finally, he settled on old jeans he had kept from college and a simple blue sweater. Looking at himself in the mirror, he realized he looked more like the person he had been before success had changed him into. Someone who owned 30 identical business suits. Emma's apartment was in a modest neighborhood 20 minutes from downtown. When she answered the door, she was wearing faded jeans and a volunteer t-shirt from the clinic. Her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked fresh and energetic despite having worked a 12-hour shift 2 days earlier. "Ready to see how the other half lives?" she asked with a smile that made his chest tighten in an unexpected way. The free clinic was housed in a converted warehouse in one of Seattle's transitional neighborhoods. As they walked through the entrance, Jonathan was immediately struck by the organized chaos inside. Volunteers were setting up folding chairs, sorting donated medications, and preparing examination areas that had been created with portable dividers. Emma, a woman in her 60s with silver hair, approached them. "Thank goodness you're here. We have twice as many people waiting as usual, and Dr. Martinez called in sick." "This is Jonathan," Emma said simply. "He's here to help." The woman, who introduced herself as Diane, looked at Jonathan with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many well-meaning volunteers come and go. "Any medical experience?" "None at all," Jonathan answered honestly. "Perfect. You can work intake with me." "Emma, can you handle triage until Dr. Peterson arrives?" For the next 6 hours, Jonathan found himself in a world that operated on completely different principles than anything he had known. There were no profit margins or efficiency reports. Success was measured in blood pressure readings and prescription assistance, in helping an elderly woman understand her medication instructions, or finding reading glasses for a man who couldn't afford an eye exam. His first patient was Rosa Martinez, a woman in her 40s who worked 2 part-time jobs without benefits. She needed her blood pressure medication refilled but hadn't been able to afford a doctor's visit. Jonathan helped her fill out paperwork and learned that she sent most of her paycheck to support her mother in Mexico while trying to save money for her teenage son's college applications. "You're very kind to volunteer here," Rosa told him as they finished the forms. "Not everyone understands how important this place is." Jonathan realized he was one of those people who hadn't understood, hadn't even known places like this existed. In his world, healthcare was something you purchased like any other service. The idea that people had to choose between medication and groceries was completely foreign to his experience. That as the morning progressed, he watched Emma work with patients, moving between examination areas with quiet efficiency. She remembered details about people who had been here before, asking about grandchildren and job searches. She treated each person with the same careful attention she would give a paying patient at the hospital. During their lunch break, taken in a small break room with mismatched furniture, Emma asked him what he thought of the morning. "It's incredible," Jonathan said, meaning it. "How many people do you see here each week?" "About 200, but we could help twice that many if we had more resources. We're always running low on basic supplies, and we can only afford to be open 1 day a week." Jonathan found himself doing mental calculations. The cost of keeping this clinic open full-time would be less than he spent on his car collection. The amount they needed for basic medical supplies was what he paid for. Single business lunch with investors. "What would it take to expand?" he asked. Emma looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because this matters. What you're doing here matters more than most of what I do all week. Jonathan, you don't need to save us. We've been managing. I'm not trying to save you. I'm trying to figure out how to help something that should exist, that needs to exist." They were interrupted by Dr. Peterson arriving for the afternoon shift, and Emma returned to her volunteer duties. But Jonathan noticed her glancing at him throughout the afternoon, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle. As they prepared to leave at 4 o'clock, Diane approached Jonathan again. "You're welcome back anytime. You have a good way with people." Outside, as they walked to their cars, Emma stopped and turned to face him. "What you said about expanding the clinic, were you serious?" "Completely serious. Emma, I make more money in a month than this place needs to operate for a year. It seems almost criminal not to help. But why? You just learned this place existed this morning." Jonathan thought about his answer carefully. "Because this morning I met Rosa Martinez, who works 2 jobs and can't afford blood pressure medication. Because I watched you treat every person like they mattered, regardless of whether they could pay. Because for the first time in years, I felt useful instead of just successful." Emma studied his face in the fading afternoon light. "You know, when I first saw you yesterday morning, I thought you were just another rich guy who might help once and then go back to his comfortable life. What do you think now?" "I think you might be someone who's been looking for a reason to care about something real." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding that something significant was happening between them, something that went beyond attraction or curiosity. "Emma, would you have dinner with me again? Somewhere we can actually talk without the diner closing around us, your place or mine?" she asked with a mischievous smile. "How about I cook for you? I have a kitchen I've never actually used." 2 hours later, Emma stood in Jonathan's penthouse apartment, looking out at the city view that had cost him more than most people's houses. But instead of being impressed by the expensive furniture and artwork, she seemed more interested in the empty spaces. "It's beautiful," she said carefully, "but it doesn't feel much like home." Jonathan looked around his apartment through her eyes and realized she was right. It was perfectly designed and professionally decorated, but there was nothing personal about it, nothing that revealed who he actually was beyond his wealth. "I'm not sure I remember how to make a home," he admitted. "It's not about the furniture, it's about filling the space with things and people that matter to you." They cooked dinner together, or rather, Emma cooked while Jonathan attempted to help, and mostly got in the way. She had stopped at a grocery store and bought ingredients for pasta and salad, refusing to let him hire a chef or order from an expensive restaurant. "The best meals are the ones you make with your own hands," she insisted, showing him how to properly dice vegetables, as they worked in his unused kitchen. Jonathan realized this was the most relaxed he had felt in his own home in years. Emma moved around the space as if she belonged there, humming quietly while she cooked, asking him questions about his life that no one had ever bothered to ask. Over dinner, she told him about her patients from the week, people whose names and stories she remembered long after their treatment ended. Jonathan found himself sharing memories of his childhood, stories he hadn't thought about in years, about the man he had been before success had changed him. What happened to that person? Emma asked after he told her about volunteering at a homeless shelter when he was in college. I guess I convinced myself that making money was more important than making a difference, that if I became successful enough, I could help people in bigger ways later. And did you? Jonathan realized he had never asked himself that question. He had donated money to various charities, mostly for tax benefits and good publicity, but he had never personally involved himself in helping anyone. No, he said quietly. I just kept getting more successful and more isolated. Emma reached across the table and took his hand. It's not too late, you know, to be both successful and useful. That night, after Emma went home, Jonathan sat in his empty apartment and made a decision that would change everything. He opened his laptop and began researching free clinics, homeless shelters, and community health centers throughout Seattle. For the first time in his career, he was planning to invest in something that would never generate a profit. The next morning, he called Emma at the hospital during her break. I want to fund the clinic expansion, he said without preamble. Jonathan, you can't just throw money at everything. I'm not throwing money. I want to be involved. I want to help run it, to work there regularly. I want to do something that matters. There was a long pause. Are you sure? This isn't a tax write-off or a publicity opportunity. This is real work, with real people who need real help. I've never been more sure of anything. That evening, Emma came to his apartment again, this time bringing a folder full of information about the clinic's needs and expansion possibilities. They spread papers across his dining table and worked for hours, planning how to transform the one-day-a-week operation into a full-time community health center. We could serve 1,000 people a week, Emma said, excitement lighting up her eyes. We could offer preventive care, health, education, prescription assistance programs. Jonathan watched her face as she talked about the possibilities, and realized he was falling in love with her passion for helping people, with her belief that everyone deserved access to healthcare regardless of their ability to pay. 3 months later, the Riverside Community Health Center opened in a renovated building that had once housed a failed shopping mall. Jonathan had not only funded the expansion but had also convinced 2 other billionaire friends to contribute, turning it into a collaborative effort that could serve the entire South Seattle area. On opening day, Emma found Jonathan in the waiting area, wearing scrubs and a volunteer badge, helping an elderly man fill out insurance forms. How does it feel? She asked. During a quiet moment, Jonathan looked around at the bustling activity, at families receiving care they couldn't have afforded elsewhere, at volunteers and staff working together to serve their community. It feels like coming home, he said. That evening, after the last patient had been seen and the doors were locked, Emma and Jonathan stood together in the empty waiting area, surrounded by the evidence of what they had built together. Thank you, Emma said softly. For what? For hearing me when I called for help that morning. For stopping when you could have kept driving. Jonathan pulled her close, understanding finally that the morning Henry Chen collapsed on the sidewalk had saved more than one life. It had saved him from an existence that had been successful but meaningless, wealthy but empty. Thank you for shouting loud enough to wake me up, he said, and kissed her under the fluorescent lights of the health center they had created together. Outside, Seattle continued its daily rhythm, but for Jonathan Clarke and Emma Rodriguez, everything had changed. They had discovered that love wasn't just about finding someone who completed you, but about finding someone who inspired you to become the person you were meant to be. And it had all started with a simple shout on a busy morning, when a nurse refused to let a stranger die alone, and a billionaire remembered what it felt like to care about something more important than his next board meeting. 6 months later, when Henry Chen returned to thank them both for saving his life, he found them working side by side in the health center, no longer strangers from different worlds, but partners in building something that would outlast any stock portfolio or quarterly report. They had learned that sometimes the most successful life is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you give away, and that the most valuable investments are the ones made in other people's well-being. The simple shout that had brought them together continued to echo through their community, in every life they touched and every person they helped heal, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can create the biggest changes in the world.